The human rights group Amnesty International says that attacks by militants in western Niger have worsened significantly since the start of the year, with children increasingly targeted. A report by the group says that the conflict in the Tillabéri region, which borders Mali and Burkina Faso, is having a devastating impact. According to the report, more than 500 civilians have died between the 1st of January and the 29th of July this year from conflicts in the region, exceeding the 397 people that were killed in 2020. Over 60 children have been killed by armed groups in the tri-border area. One jihadist group linked to Al-Qaeda has intensified its efforts to recruit boys to its ranks. The group lures young men and boys aged between 15 and 17 or younger by using incentives such as food, money and clothes. Hundreds of schools in the Tillabéri region have been closed as a result of the violence. The report accuses Niger's security forces of not only failing to protect civilians, but also of committing abuses. Well, for more on this report, we're now joined by Janine Morner, who's Amnesty International's researcher on children and armed conflict. Janine, thanks very much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is a very disturbing report about children being caught up in this conflict in Niger. Tell us a little bit more about what you found in your investigations.
Yeah, absolutely. When we first began looking at this particular piece of research, there really was very little information about how children in particular had been affected and targeted by the conflict. So when we began, we went in not really sure what we were going to find, and we were quite shocked by the findings. This year has really been an important turning point in the conflict, particularly in the Niger region. As you mentioned, I think earlier, about over 500 people have been killed in conflict-related deaths this year. We looked at the operations of two primary armed groups, the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, which is an Islamic State affiliate, and GENEM, which stands for the Group for the Support of Islam and Muslims, which is an and their operations across Niger. As you mentioned, both groups have a position against secular or Western education. They have targeted schools, attacked teachers, and it's led to unprecedented school closures in that area. Over 377 schools are closed. About 31,000 students have been pushed out of schools. ISGS has been carrying out rampant attacks across the border, near the border. Arrive in villages, often with scarves or glasses covering their faces, and drive through, killing people at random, sometimes more than 100 people at a go. They've been targeting older boys, young men, other civilians as well. And they leave villages completely uninhabitable. So when they go, they burn granaries, they loot livestock, they loot clinics, and they force people into displacement and have left people completely destitute. As you mentioned, GENEM, which is the primary group along the border with Burkina Faso, has been recruiting and using children. And they've also left women in these areas almost completely invisible. So women are often not allowed to participate in activities outside of the home. So they can't do things like farm, collect firewood, or go to the market, things that they would normally do to supplement the food at the house, or to earn an income. Some young women and girls have been abducted or been forced to marry fighters as well. And in all of these cases, the government has been slow to respond and has really left people very vulnerable in these areas to abuses.
You've said in your report that the authorities perhaps may have also been guilty of abuses. What kind of things have you been able to find out?
So the premise, most of the focus of the report really has been on the Nigerian government's response and the sort of slow response they've had to violations. However, there has been some reporting in the past by Amnesty International, as well as other groups that have looked at cases of arbitrary arrest, enforced disappearances, and extrajudicial killings, all of which we feel have grave implications for older boys as well.
So Niger is just north of Nigeria, and it's the north of Nigeria that we're seeing these kidnappings of children. Is this the same kind of people that are committing these crimes? And what is it about children that they seem to be increasing targets?
Yeah. Well, there are some connections between the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara and in Nigeria, ISWAP, which is also an Islamic State affiliate, in the sense that they are both at least ideologically opposed to Western education and have targeted schools. So in that sense, there is a link. Fortunately, in Niger, there haven't been as many incidences of kidnappings as they have been in Nigeria. But with the current trend, there definitely are some concerns that is going to be something that is going to increase. There have been some abductions of local authorities. As I mentioned before, there have been some abductions of young women as well. And I think children are a target for a couple of different reasons. I think, first of all, when you come into a village and you kill at random and you show that you're willing to kill children, it really instills a sense of fear in the population. If you want them to acquiesce, if you want them to make sure that they are not spying on you or reporting you to authorities, I think killing children is something that really does instill fear in the population. And then children are also very easy targets for recruitment. They're easy to manipulate. They can, be used to create a very loyal fighting force. They can be lured through things like money, food, things like that. It's an incredibly poor part of the world. And those are the sorts of things that they can use to recruit children. And so I think that's also one of the reasons why they really are targets in that part of the world.
I don't know of any religion that justifies the killing of children and the treatment of women in the way that's being described, but it does seem as if there's a religious overtone, extreme in its nature, in these attacks. Have you been able to explain what that is?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked this question. I think from our findings, even though there's a professed sort of ideological overtone to all of the attacks, these are groups that have pledged allegiance to the Islamic State, that have pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda. In many ways, the conflicts in those areas are driven by local tensions, pre-existing ethnic tensions, tensions between pastoralists and settler farmers. And we've actually found that much more than, even though there are ideological sort of overtones to what's happening, a lot is actually really driven by those intercommunal tensions as well.
All right, so I think you gave us a clue already, but schooling must be one of the things that really have suffered as a result of this kind of conflict.
Oh, absolutely. I think Niger statistically has the highest rate of children out of school. And so you can only imagine what having 377 schools in that region must do to education. It's really devastating access to education in those areas. I think what's more important is that, when people are displaced, it's also not as if they are re-enrolling in schools. In many of these areas, there's really a lack of government presence. There's a very limited humanitarian presence, partly because armed groups are very much intertwined with the local population, and children are missing several years of school. Many children that we spoke to hadn't been to school for many years, and it's very difficult to secure teachers in these regions. They are deliberately targeted by the groups. And it's having an incredibly devastating effect.
And with this scorched earth policy that they have of leaving villages uninhabitable, what is happening to these villages? Is this just escalating a humanitarian crisis? Oh,
absolutely. The group Islamic State in the Greater Sahara has really been responsible for this sort of scorched earth policy. And analysts haven't really been able to pinpoint why there's been this shift in operations, but they seem very intent on driving the populations from those areas and making them completely uninhabitable, basically creating territories where they can move unimpeded by authorities, unimpeded by the local population. And it's having a devastating impact. I think in May, about 102,000 people in that region had been displaced, millions more if you look at the Mali and Burkina Faso borders as well. They're forced into areas that often don't have the resources to accommodate them. One of the major issues that came up when we were doing interviews is families often move into host communities and don't have access to farming land. And so there are real concerns about food shortages because they cannot farm in the areas where they came from. They cannot farm in the areas where they go. And of course, all of those things have very disproportionate impact on children who can suffer from malnutrition and stuntedness.
Who is able to help these people?
Yeah. Well, we call for three things in the report. I think the first is really to reinforce the security in the border areas. It became very clear through the research that as soon as the Nigerian military forces withdrew from the area, armed groups took advantage and really ran rampant in those areas. And so I think we're really calling for the reinforcement of security in those areas. We're looking to scale up the humanitarian response, especially in terms of programming for children. That includes things like access to education, programming to limit the recruitment and use of children, access to psychosocial support. I think one of the things I didn't mention was the immense psychological toll that this kind of imminent threat of attack was having on children that came across very clearly. And then the other thing we're looking to do is really encourage additional monitoring through the UN and government and NGOs in those spaces of violations that are taking place, so that they can be appropriate programmatic responses to what's happening.
All right. You know, sadly, Niger is not a country that's often in the headlines, even though the Sahel generally is problematic. But is there international forces in the region taking care of Niger as well, or is that sadly as forgotten as it is in the news cycle?
There is an alliance called the G5 Sahel that's made up of a number of Sahelian countries, which has been supported by the French. There is also an international task force that was recently put together that brings together a number of European security operatives to provide, I think, mostly guidance and support to the Nigerian security services. So it hasn't been completely abandoned, but a lot does fall on the hands of the Nigerian military, which is, at this stage, I would say, very demoralized, fatigued, and has been really struggling to take control of what's been happening in those border areas.
How long has this been going on at this level of, I mean, it just sounds extreme. How long has it been?
Yeah. Well, it depends how far back you want to go. But, you know, in 2012, you know, this sort of was really sort of the escalation of the turmoil in that area, with separatist armed groups in Mali sort of trying to pull away. And those groups have just expanded and deepened their reach slowly over the course of the last 9 years, spilling over first into Burkina Faso, where we've now seen millions of people displaced and even more severe attacks taking place. Along the border with Niger, things have really escalated, I would say, over the course of the last 18 months, and it's just continuing to deepen and spread. And it's a very worrying sign. I think one of the reasons we really wanted to do the report in Niger in particular is we feel that this is an important turning point, that things are starting to deteriorate so rapidly that if there is not more urgent action taken at this time, it could very well follow in the footsteps of neighboring Burkina Faso and Mali, where the scale of violations is even greater.
I know that your focus has been on the children. And I'm just wondering, yes, many are being killed, but I guess there's also a good number that's being orphaned.
Oh, yes, absolutely. There is a policy of targeting older men in particular. Groups very much want to shut down the possibility of men mobilizing into self-defense groups. And so that has been a major issue. You also have issues where men from those areas have left, and so have sometimes left women and children in those areas, and so that has impacts on farming and things like that. So yeah, children being orphaned is also an issue.
Janine, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks very, very much indeed for your time and bringing this story to us. Thank you so much indeed for highlighting it.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, that's Janine Morna with Amnesty International. She's a researcher, Children and Armed Conflict. A very disturbing report there coming out about the crisis in Niger, and urgent action very much required to help our children there, and also the villagers who are finding their villages scorched and uninhabitable after militants have been through them.